The truth is coming out, and you can't bury it. This is outrageous. We demand you leave. Not until justice is served.
The day I came home from deployment, I expected quiet. After months of dust, noise, and constant alertness, all I wanted was the familiar sight of my street, the small piece of land I'd worked years to buy, and the peace of knowing it was still mine. Instead, I found strangers standing on it. At first, I thought it was a mistake. A crew of workers had trucks parked along the curb, bright survey flags stabbed into the ground, and a large wooden sign planted right where my mailbox used to be. The sign didn't welcome me home. It advertised something called Phase 3 expansion. My land was part of it. I remember standing there in silence, staring at the boundary line that used to mark my property. The fence I had built before deployment was gone. The shed I stored my tools in was gone. Even the gravel driveway had been scraped clean like it had never existed. And according to the paperwork the workers casually waved at me, it hadn't. Because while I was overseas, while I was thousands of miles away doing a job most people in my neighborhood barely understood, my HOA had apparently decided my land was abandoned. They didn't call, they didn't wait, they didn't even try to contact me through the military. Instead, they voted, and that vote allowed them to sell my property to a developer. Just like that, the land I legally owned had been absorbed into their precious subdivision expansion plan. The HOA board had already celebrated the deal. Construction permits were approved, survey lines were drawn. To them, the problem was already solved, but there was one detail they didn't think about, because the land they sold wasn't just mine, and the paperwork protecting it wasn't sitting in some local county office. It was sitting inside a federal system that the HOA board clearly didn't understand, which meant that by the time they realized what they had done, it was already too late. So how exactly did a small suburban HOA go from celebrating a profitable land deal to watching the military step in and repossess their entire subdivision? Before all of this happened, my life in that neighborhood was simple. The subdivision sat on the edge of a quiet town where most people knew each other well enough to wave when passing by. Neatly trimmed lawns lined the streets, and every driveway looked almost identical. The HOA loved that. They prided themselves on keeping the community perfect. For the most part, I didn't mind. I had bought my small piece of land there years earlier, long before the area started expanding. It wasn't huge, but it was mine. A modest house, a gravel driveway, a wooden fence I built myself, and a small shed where I kept tools and old camping gear. Nothing fancy, just a place that felt stable after years of moving around. My job meant I was gone a lot. Deployments were part of the reality, and everyone in the neighborhood knew that. When I left for my last deployment, I made sure everything was taken care of. Bills were automated, the property taxes were paid well in advance, and a neighbor occasionally checked the mailbox. From my perspective, the house was just sitting there, waiting for me to return. But while I was overseas, the neighborhood started changing. Developers had begun buying land around the subdivision, turning empty lots into rows of identical homes. The HOA board suddenly had bigger plans for the community. Meetings became more frequent. Newsletters talked about future growth and expansion opportunities. Most residents barely paid attention, but a few small details started to shift. Survey crews began appearing around the edges of the neighborhood. Temporary markers popped up near property lines. Rumors spread about a new phase of homes being added to the subdivision. And somewhere in those quiet HOA meetings, my property started appearing on their maps. At first, it was probably just a convenient empty space. After all, the owner was gone. And to the HOA board, an empty lot sitting in the middle of their expansion plans must have looked like an opportunity waiting to be claimed. At first, the HOA didn't treat my property like something they planned to sell. They treated it like a problem. The moment I deployed overseas, the violation notices started piling up. I didn't see them at the time, of course. Every letter was mailed to the house I wasn't living in, slowly stacking inside the mailbox while I was thousands of miles away. According to the HOA records I later saw, the first complaint was about the grass. After a few weeks without anyone mowing it, the lawn had grown uneven. That alone was enough for the HOA to send a formal warning. Then came the second notice about yard maintenance, then another about the fence needing inspection. Each notice carried a small fine, $10, $25, $50. Individually, they were small enough to seem harmless. But every letter also carried the same quiet warning buried in the text. Failure to resolve violations could lead to additional penalties or administrative action. No one called me. No one checked to see why the house was empty. But the HOA board kept documenting everything, every unmowed patch of grass. Every day the mailbox stayed full. Every week the driveway sat untouched. On their spreadsheets, my home started looking less like a residence and more like an abandoned property. And that was exactly the narrative they needed. Months into my deployment, the HOA escalated the issue. They issued a notice claiming the property had accumulated multiple unresolved violations and unpaid fines. The fines themselves were tiny compared to the bigger move they were preparing, because once those violations existed on paper, the HOA suddenly had justification to take corrective action. That's when the surveyors started showing up. At first, they stayed near the edge of the property, measuring and placing temporary markers in the dirt. A few curious neighbors noticed, but most assumed it was part of the subdivision's planned expansion. Then one day, construction stakes appeared directly across the front yard. That was the moment the quiet rumors around the neighborhood started spreading. Some residents asked the HOA board about it during a meeting. The answer they received was vague but confident. The board claimed the property had been legally processed as neglected, and that steps were being taken to integrate it into the next phase of development. In other words, the house in the middle of the expansion map was about to disappear. Within weeks, the decisions moved faster. Documents were signed. A developer purchased the parcel, and before anyone stopped to question how a property with a legal owner could suddenly be sold, demolition crews arrived. The fence was removed first, then the shed, then the gravel driveway. By the time my deployment ended, the land I owned had already been cleared like it had never belonged to me at all. The HOA board thought they had found the perfect loophole: an empty house, a stack of violation notices, and a homeowner too far away to fight back. What they didn't realize was that the paperwork protecting that land didn't just sit at the county courthouse. It sat inside a federal system connected directly to my deployment status. And the moment I came home and started asking questions, the entire situation began to unravel.
This is unacceptable. Your decisions are hurting this community.
We followed the rules, Daniel.
Rules that are wrong.
The moment I realized what the HOA had actually done, the situation stopped being a neighborhood dispute. It became a federal problem. At first, the HOA board acted confident when I contacted them. They treated the entire situation like it was already finished. According to them, my property had accumulated violations, unpaid fines, and months of abandonment. Their attorney claimed the board had followed the proper procedure to reclaim the land and transfer it to a developer. In their eyes, the case was closed, but there was one law they clearly didn't understand, because when someone is deployed overseas, their property is protected under federal law. The rules are extremely clear. You cannot penalize, seize, or force a sale on property owned by an active duty service member without very specific legal steps and court approval. The HOA had skipped every single one. The more documents my lawyer reviewed, the worse it became for them. Every violation notice had been mailed to an empty house while I was deployed. The fines were issued without any real attempt to contact me. And the decision to label the property abandoned had been approved entirely by the HOA board. No court, no federal clearance, nothing. Once the developer realized this, the entire situation began collapsing. The land they had purchased was suddenly tied to a serious legal violation. Construction permits froze overnight. Survey markers disappeared. Equipment that had been parked on the property quietly vanished within days. But the biggest moment came during a very uncomfortable HOA meeting. Word had spread around the neighborhood by then. Residents filled the small community room, whispering to each other while the board members sat stiffly at the front table. For months, they had acted like they controlled everything in the neighborhood. Now they were waiting for answers, because my lawyer had just delivered a formal notice. Under federal protections for deployed service members, the HOA's actions weren't just invalid, they exposed the entire subdivision to serious legal consequences. The forced sale, the demolition, and the property transfer were all now under investigation. And since the developer had already begun planning new homes across that land, every permit connected to the project was suddenly tied to the dispute. In simple terms, the subdivision expansion the HOA had proudly approved could no longer legally move forward. The board members looked stunned. They had tried to take one property. Instead, they had placed the entire subdivision in the middle of a federal legal storm, and the real consequences were only just beginning. By the time the legal dust started settling, the HOA board finally understood the scale of what they had done. At first, they tried to downplay everything. They claimed it was a misunderstanding, a paperwork error, a technical oversight that had simply gotten out of control. But those explanations didn't hold up once the legal process began pulling their decisions apart piece by piece. Because every document told the same story. The violation notices had been issued while I was deployed. The fines had been stacked without any real attempt to reach me. The property had been labeled abandoned by a vote of the HOA board, and the sale had been approved without a single step that federal law required when the owner was on active duty. Each mistake alone might have been manageable, but together they formed a clear pattern, and that pattern made it impossible for the HOA to argue they had acted responsibly. Within weeks, the developer backed out of the deal entirely. The land transfer was voided, the permits were canceled, and the expansion plan the HOA had been promoting for months collapsed overnight. What had once been advertised as the future phase of the neighborhood suddenly became a frozen construction site surrounded by caution tape. But undoing the damage wasn't simple. The fence had been removed, the shed had been demolished. The land itself had been scraped and cleared. Restoring the property became the HOA's responsibility, not because they volunteered to fix it, but because the legal pressure left them with no other choice. The cost quickly started piling up. They had to reverse the sale, they had to repair the land, and they had to compensate for the destruction that had already happened. What started as a small attempt to absorb one empty lot into their expansion plan ended up draining the HOA's budget far more than they ever expected. But the financial consequences were only the beginning. The real impact hit during the next few HOA elections. For years, the same group of board members had controlled the neighborhood. They made decisions behind closed doors, passed rules most residents barely understood, and rarely expected anyone to challenge them. This time, the entire community had watched what happened. They saw how easily the board had labeled a neighbor's property abandoned. They saw how quickly the land had been sold without proper oversight. And they saw how close the entire subdivision came to being tangled in a federal legal case. Trust in the board disappeared almost overnight. At the next election meeting, residents packed the community hall again, but this time the atmosphere was very different from the tense silence during the legal announcement. Now people were angry. One by one, the old board members lost their seats. Some resigned before the vote even happened. Others tried to defend their decisions, but struggled to explain why they had moved so aggressively against a homeowner who was clearly serving overseas. Within a few months, the leadership of the HOA had completely changed. The new board immediately started reviewing past policies and rewriting several of the procedures that had allowed the situation to spiral so badly. Rules about property violations were updated, communication policies were tightened, and one new guideline appeared in the HOA handbook that hadn't existed before. Any property connected to an active duty service member would now require careful review before any enforcement action could even begin. It was a quiet acknowledgement that the old board's decisions had crossed a line they never should have approached. As for the land itself, it eventually returned to something close to what it had been before. The fence was rebuilt, the driveway was restored, the empty space where the shed once stood slowly filled with grass again. It took time, but the property finally started looking like a home instead of a construction zone. Neighbors who had watched the entire situation unfold began treating the place differently too. Some stopped by to apologize for not questioning the survey crews earlier. Others admitted they had assumed the HOA must have known what they were doing. Most people in the neighborhood had never imagined the board could push their authority that far. But now they knew, and the HOA board knew it too, because the lesson they learned was far more expensive than the piece of land they tried to take. They thought they were dealing with an empty property. They thought a few violation notices and a quiet vote would make the problem disappear. Instead, they triggered a legal chain reaction that dismantled their expansion plans, forced them to repair the damage they caused, and ultimately cost them their positions on the board. All because they made one dangerous assumption. They believed no one would challenge them. But sometimes the people you try to take advantage of are the ones protected by rules far stronger than your own. And in this case, the HOA didn't just lose a land deal. They lost control of the very neighborhood they were supposed to protect, which leaves a question worth thinking about. If a small group of people in a quiet neighborhood could make a decision that nearly cost an entire subdivision everything, how many other communities are only one bad decision away from the exact same mistake?